It's a real privilege to be here. Thank you to everyone who's here to listen. We live in a world that needs more poetry. I think these are very difficult times, and particularly so today with the invasion of Ukraine. And I've sought to talk into this moment in the poems I've selected. And I also appreciated Marie de Beer's approach recently of reading work from other poets as well as her own. So I have included a fair number of additional voices into this reading tonight. Am I hearable and audible? Because I'm not looking at any of you, I'm just looking at what's written on the screen in front of me.
You are audible and everything.
Thanks. This first poem is called Unreceiving News of the War, and it was written in the first few weeks of the First World War in 1914. Snow is a strange white word. No ice or frost have asked of bud or bird for winter's cost. Yet ice and frost and snow from earth to sky, this summer land doth know, no man knows why. In all men's hearts it is some spirit old, hath turned with malign kiss our lives to mold. Red fangs have torn his face, God's blood is shed. He mourns from his lone place, his children dead. O ancient crimson curse, corrode, consume, give back this universe its pristine bloom. The writer of this poem is Isaac Rosenberg. T.S. Eliot was to praise him as the most remarkable of the British First World War poets. And this poem, in fact, was written here in Cape Town, where he was relocated at the time for health reasons, and was either written in Sandown Lodge facing onto Rondebosch Park in the mountain, where he spent much of his time, or in District 6, where his sister lived. And I think it's quite a unique poem in being full of a sense of foreboding and worry, unlike the jingoistic poetry that I think was typical of that time. Isaac Rosenberg, if you don't know the history, returned to Britain in 1915, joined the British Army as a private, wrote some extraordinary poems in the trenches, and was killed in 1918. Wars, even small ones, come with a terrible price. I remember my worst day of war in Cape Town. Those days in 1986 when the Crossroads informal settlement was destroyed and this massive tower of smoke kept pouring into the sky for days. And I remember this one day so well, doing relief work in the smoke and then arriving back at my communal house at 2 o'clock in the morning with a full moon in the sky to find the front door was unlocked, the lights were on, but nobody was in the house. And it was the beginning of a very hard period. And this poem is called The Grammar of the Wound. How were we to know that the coils of destiny had already wrapped themselves around our young throats that first night of the second state of emergency, as the full moon rose unseen behind the fire of Crossroads, the ash falling so delicately on frenzied friends or foes who wander like gray ghosts, a blanket of smoke muting the gunshots and the soft call of comrades looking for each other. Or that 3 young men who sat around our hearth would be the human sacrifices that here of frayed eclipse, or the grief of those I love so thick, my heart withered back into itself, a wound I hid under bandages without adjective for years. The ash falling so delicately, my housemate taken too that night of smoke. I find the lights on, but nobody home. Each new loss breaks strand by strand the bonds that hold us. We loiter on the slopes, looking down into the prison. The kites we fly for her tethered tightly, but still free in the wind. Can she not see us there so young against the burnt mountainside as we reach out in the morning air? The ash falling so delicately, weighed down by the tombstones of our dead, we try to resuscitate what we had, collapsing towards freedom like floppy dolls. I recount all this to a friend I love, conjugating the wound again in the present tense. I sense her heart wither back into itself, unpunctuated. It is all too much, as the ash keeps falling so delicately, without substance, but holding the original form until the last ember dies, and it dissipates as air. I've been reading Joseph Brodsky, the great Russian poet, recently. He was expelled from the Soviet Union, I think in around 1972, got the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1987. And he has this, I think, quite amazing long poem. It's in fact a book called The Part of Speech, which has some resonance with that last poem because of how grammar becomes a poetic metaphor. But I think it also speaks very powerfully into the current situation in Ukraine. And I just read the last two stanzas because it's a very long poem. A Part of Speech by Joseph Brodsky. And when the future is uttered, swarms of mice rush out of the Russian language and gnaw a piece of ripened memory, which is twice as hole-ridden as real cheese. After all these years, it hardly matters who or what stands in the corner, hidden by heavy drapes, and your mind resounds not with a seraphic dew, only their rustle. Life that no one dares to appraise, like that gift horse's mouth bears its teeth in a grin at each encounter. What gets left of a man amounts to a part, to his spoken part, to a part of speech. Not that I'm losing my grip. I'm just tired of summer. You reach for a shirt in the drawer and the day is wasted. If only winter were here for snow to smother all these streets, these humans. But first the blasted green, I would sleep in my clothes or just pluck a borrowed book while what's left of the year's slack rhythm, like a dog abandoning its blind owner, crosses the road at the usual zebra. Freedom is when you forget the spelling of the tyrant's name and your mouth's saliva is sweeter than Persian pie. And though your brain is wrung tight as the horn of a ram, nothing drops from your pale blue eye. Not many years after the horror of Crossroads, we were exploring a different future in South Africa. And I remember in preparation for the local government negotiations in Cape Town, I was part of a very diverse group of 40 people drawn from all the different political, civic groups in Cape Town. And we went on this long study tour that took us to Curitiba in Brazil, to New York. But we in fact started our journey in Africa, and we visited a country that just had emerged from this very long struggle against an occupying power with no support from anybody from the West, from the rest of the continent, and against Ethiopia as the occupying power, which was supported by the Soviet Union, and they prevailed. And for a brief moment, Eritrea represented this inspiring African success story, and then it went horribly wrong, and they got sucked into this crushing authoritarianism and an utterly pointless, terrible war with Ethiopia over some desolate plains at Badme. And in that brief war, 100,000 soldiers were estimated to have been killed. It was one of those First World War trench kind of wars. And I suppose this is a poem just about that experience. It's called Stubborn Truth. Stubborn Truth, Asmara, Eritrea, 1993. Worn thin by hardship, still on soldiers' pay, the mayor of Asmara wears a jersey full of holes, through which his stubborn pride illuminates the plans he shares on old Italian maps. Everyone is dirt poor after the war, but I see no beggars. The streets are clean, the potholes stopped, desert dust repelled with twig brooms by old women whose stubborn pride reflects off polished pavements. The young pick and shovel a new road down to Massawa, with the stubborn pride that ruptured Russian tanks still rusting on that pass to mark their truth, abandoned by the world they would not yield. 5 years on, that stubborn pride would not yield to borderlines unclear on the old Italian maps. Those brave young Eritreans wear uniforms full of holes, and their blood congeals the dusty wastes of Badmi. The next poem also talks about hubris in relation to war, a very different type of hubris, indifference. And it's by an Ukrainian-American poet, Ilya Kaminsky, who was born in Odessa in Ukraine. His family fled, I think, in 1993. Ilya lost almost all his hearing when he was very young. And his book, Deaf Republic, which I think was published last year, it is an exceptional work. He is also a founder of Poets for Peace. And this poem is called We Lived Happily During the War by Ilya Kaminsky. And when they bombed other people's houses, we protested, but not enough. We opposed them, but not enough. I was in my bed. Around my bed, America was falling, invisible house by invisible house by invisible house. I took a chair outside and watched the sun. In the 6th month of a disastrous reign in the house of money, in the street of money, in the city of money, in the country of money, our great country of money, we, forgive us, lived happily during the war. And another poem from Deaf Republic, very prescient poem given everything that is happening today. It's called 9 a.m. Bombardment. It has begun. I saw how the blue canary of my country picks breadcrumbs from each soldier's hair, picks breadcrumbs from each soldier's eyes. Rain leaves the earth and falls straight up as it should. To have a country so important, to run into walls, into streetlights, into loved ones, as one should. Watch their legs as they run and fall. I have seen the blue canary of my country. Watch their legs as they run and fall. Somehow in South Africa, we managed to pull ourselves out of a path of escalating war. And this next poem is just about one small moment from that time in the 1990s, a small moment of a much larger national journey. And it's called Common Ascent and subtitled The Inaugural Meeting of the Cape Town Metropolitan Negotiating Forum, Athlone Civic Centre, 1993. The clanging dissonance had yet to be stilled. As delegates took their seats, the divides unbridged by the official green felt covering the empty space between us. On one side, the privileged, on the other, the excluded, facing off like a choir in an old cathedral, but without music, a muted place. A musician from a minor party confides that he has not played since that petrol bomb that did his double bass. Days before, a few young men from the armed wing of the Pan-Africanist Congress played to that older score. The staccato sounds of guns echoed through observatory, 3 students and a pub owner dead on that familiar floor. And in its bleeding resonance, the delegates of the ruling National Party arrived in dry clean suits to state, with sad reluctance, but in no uncertain terms, they would boycott if the meeting let the PAC participate. We forget the improvisation it took to listen beyond immediate rage, to hear syncopation in the bruising missteps, to know the angry ones had to be carried and the enemies strengthened so they could sing that note beyond their range, and how on that first night, The representative of the PAC, a teacher, said with raw firmness that his movement was not the only party guilty of atrocity, but that he would withdraw, notwithstanding, for his participation was less important than the meeting which went ahead, national party present through that simple act of grace, and how the man from the PAC remained seated at the table by common assent. And how 2 years later, a new city was sung into being, composed by harmonized consensus across all past discord, how the parties danced, the ascendant and the eclipsed, how they danced to the podium to sign the common accord, and how for a still moment in this quavered life, we were bound in common voice and released from bonds of earth and soared like angels over Cape Town, even as the future beckoned in the bitter blood of its very human afterbirth. And yet that feeling of cooperation and solidarity and generosity across divides that made the impossible happen, it dissipated. And many people, many good people I knew became angry, suspicious, even cruel, even corrupt under the pressures of politics and leadership. And I spent a lot of time thinking through how is this possible? What's happening? And latched onto Melanie Klein, the psychologist's concept of this concept that two basic psychological dispositions inhabit every human psyche: the assertive, self-centered, aggressive, what she calls paranoid, schizoid position, and the empathetic, generous, sacrificial, more mature, depressive position, where our psychological health, of course, lies in the integration of those two positions, but of course, where pressures and conflict and politics can trap us into that paranoid, schizoid mode where we manifest our very worst selves. One of the things that Purvis Moorman, our mentor at UWC, our extraordinary and generous mentor, encouraged us to do was to write poems that created a feel of disquiet and discomfort. And in these next series of poems, I've tried to explore those issues by accessing a particularly discomforting emotion or feeling and trying to express this inner relationship between a self-assertive and aggressive he and a generally more empathetic and kind she. With the following intro: we are broken apart, he and she, us and them, my own split soul. How do we heal ourselves, clothe our victim in garments of light, stitch our perpetrator up in kindness, melt our armor, find those moments of reprieve? And the first one is called Cracked. She still has the ears of a wild dog, acutely aware of distant sounds of distress. He has made himself invulnerable, sharp shards freed of the weight that breaks the jar. She wants a cottage by the sea, where they can close the windows to the storm and catch lightning in the shuttered glass. The next one is called House of Wood, which has its resonances, I think, with today. The fires start on days of hard-won calm as she relaxes into herself while he smolders without the oxygen of war and feels in her distracted gaze his death, their natural history of combustion. She says a family is like a house built of wood. Once the fire starts, you cannot stop it. It will burn the home to the ground. The flames consume the precious things, rough-hewn love poems, artifacts of nakedness. He walks through the house with a blowtorch, roof beams collapsing over him, windows blowing out. She stands outside with a limp hosepipe, spurting water into the blistering heat, her boy pressing his face into the long grass, the neighbors staring through curtains. She does not know from where it comes, that skin so impervious to flame. She mines his stories for buried sense, family prayers on long stripped nights, knees on stone. Or are there no words for it? He has learned to walk on coals, to never look back. Fire makes things right without apology. When it is over, he sweeps the blackened shell and makes her breakfast on the embers. Can she not see he loves her? They have learned to live lightly in their house of wood, the poignancy of fragile love in one light. She says the family is like the phoenix. You can burn it down no end of times. The blood shared regenerates the burnt flesh. They start again, glue pieces together, restore facades, cover holes, hang pictures. The violation is redeemed by the forgiveness. She lies on the scorched grass. Her boy is still screaming, forgetting that families do, waiting for the fire to come. This one's called Modern Western. She digs the ground for traces of dinosaurs that roam these plains like she probes his flesh to find the moisture they once shared. Where did the water go? He blames the miners. She says the mine came first. He is of the earth, waiting for rain to settle his fury that hangs like dust over everything. She is of the sky, divining the moods like a crow surviving on the remains of dead things he leaves on his trail so he can cage her. He gathers her onto his 4-ton truck, sticks his accelerator to the floor. He has died 1,000 times in his car. She has died 1,000 times in his car wrecks. He does not mind what happens as long as someone gets hurt, so she can know, he says, how he feels. Gun control. She puts the gun on the car seat. She does not dare to touch it. She covers it with a towel. She no longer recalls who gave it to her. At the mall, she puts it in a suitcase. When she gets home, she no longer has the gun. The talk radio announces a rifle has been found. She phones in and denies the gun belongs to her. He finds himself in a church. It is bathed in stained light. He sees the gun on the altar. He assumes it must be sacred. He surrenders himself to its power. The talk radio defends his right to worship. The voices of God are in his head. He carries the gun to the mall like a cross. And of course, the other is always with us. The other is us. We cannot escape him. We somehow need to find a way to embrace him, to live with him, to save him. And this poem is called Locked Together. He double locks his door and bolts the shutters. He says he feels safe that way. She buries herself in the snow outside. Her suffering does not speak to him. What he speaks to her is what is unspoken. She cannot breathe, but she must. She makes a small hole in the top of her head. She pulls out the red silk scarf. It is tied to a blue scarf. She sees him at the sky. She stuffs the scarves back into her head. She is hanging from the sky. She cannot hold on, but she has to. He is swimming out of the shallows into the ocean. She thought he would be. She swims out to him with a life buoy. She wishes he would drown. She does not want to save him, but she does. And the last one of this series of he's and she's is called Beached. There's a wildness to the coastline here. The pounding of water on rock that will break a ship, spring tide washing over feet, pushing rotting kelp up off the beach, a blank canvas of pure sand and salt left behind. She tells him skin is not like shore. She had followed his soft eyes over the plowlands to the sea. That day she found him hurling stones at a calf who crossed over onto his land, terror in its child eyes as it caught in the barbed wire from panicked flight, and still he threw. She has had to pull stubbornness out of his earth, to reframe her forgiveness, not as weakness, but as a bias to kindness. She sits on scoured rocks. She will leave herself enough space for suffering this time. He will find her in the discomfort of the silence she has left him. And just one other poem that for me just linked into that a little bit. It's called Love in Kiev. It's by a very acclaimed Ukrainian poet, Natalka Biloserkovets, translated by Andrew Sorokovsky. And again, a poem to read tonight and a difficult poem to read tonight. Love in Kiev. More terrible is love in Kiev than magnificent Venetian passions. Butterflies fly light and maculate into bright tapers, dead caterpillars, brilliant wings of flame, and spring has lit the chestnuts, candles, cheap lipsticks, tender taste, the daring innocence of mini skirts and these coiffures that are not cut quite right, yet image, memory, and signs still move us. Tragically obvious, like the latest hit. You'll die here by a scoundrel's knife. Your blood will spread like rust inside a brand new Audi in an alien Tartaka. You'll plunge here from a balcony, the sky, down headlong to your dirty little Paris, dressed in a blouse of secretarial white. You can't discern the weddings from the deaths. For love in Kiev is more terrible than ideas of new communism. Specters emerge in the intoxicated nights out of Bald Mountain, bearing in their hands red flags and pots of red geraniums. You'll die here by a scoundrel's knife. You'll plunge here from a balcony, the sky, in a brand new Audi from an alien Tartaka, down headlong to your dirty little Paris. Your blood will spread like rust upon a blouse of secretarial white. I'm not sure how much time I have. Nondwe, how much time do I have?
So you can take 7 more minutes.
7 more minutes?
Okay. If that's too much, you can take 5.
Okay. Now, here's something a little bit different, but the same. I'm sorry about the same that we've had today. And I mean, I've just been struggling to write. I felt disordered about the state of the world. And, you know, one day, and maybe it was during the COP conference recently on climate change, where one was feeling rather despairing. And then I just, across one evening, just threw it all down, and here's my rant and rave, which maybe can't even be called a poem. And we'll just do this one, which will take a bit of time, and then a more hopeful one right at the end. This one's called "Because We Need to Turn Down the Heat." I worry we can no longer do this ourselves, because we have flash-wrapped our minds in polarized, plasticized personal protection equipment, perfumed and outer-ribbed for perfected pleasure, because it quarantines us from looking at mirrors. Because we can then blame the pangolin fetishes of Chinese peasants or the sick experiments of seduced pseudoscientists, because a single contagious conspiracy theory has more viral load than an infinite number of inert science books ghost-written by Nobel Prize winners, because the journalist dismembered in a consulate can be reconstituted as an Elvis Presley imitator who rises from the dead after being fisted in a Russian pizza parlor by Ivanka Trump, which makes her a saint. Because the fact of the ludicrous lie is that half of everybody will be predisposed to believe it, especially the devout. Because faith cannot explain the weather anymore, although the rise of the sea level tracks the ascension of the stock market towards heaven. And I'm hoping some incandescent savant like Joan of Arc or Kim Kardashian comes down from the mountain to free us before we burn her, because we need to be disordered. because it is easy to troll about whether a mosquito becomes a mosquito at conception or only when it hatches, and thus whether there's a moral difference in swatting a live mosquito or poisoning the larva ponds, because the starving baby with malaria does not care about pro-life platitudes or choice for that matter, even in Texas, because this is where we have arrived with our science. Because enough people believe vaccinations turn us into zombie sheep, because some inane influencer on Instagram with 500 million followers sells enough health supplements to know this to be true. Because how is it possible that 99% of American Bible believers could worship a golden calf sitting on a golden throne in a golden tower named after himself with Baal embossed on his forehead? Because when we can no longer collectively tell the difference between a fact, a talking point, and a batshit crazy point, then, Houston, we have a problem, because recycling the garbage in our towers of Babel is not sustainable, because the unbearable triteness of a trillion tweets generates sufficient heat to cause a cyclone in a teacup on Wall Street or launch 1,000 nuclear missiles aimed at the heart, because somewhere along the journey, love of the other went out of fashion, because we are trending apart, because feelings of grievance now have more truth than uncomfortable facts, because big men rise everywhere on magic carpets of engineered hysteria. And I write this on the southern tip of a hidden continent where the streets sprout the shelters of the homeless, who live further away from me than Silicon celebrities in San Francisco, because the algorithm only works for those of us connected, because we've been sucked into a great American psychodrama orchestrated by the devil himself, masquerading as an immortal Australian media mogul. And I'm still holding my breath about the next election because I'm scared to exhale, because CO2 is so subtle that we barely notice that breathing is an atom bomb raining on the future, because I get that I'm as guilty of killing the polar bears as the rest of us, because I too was brought up to leave my mark before some driverless autonomous pickup truck with an armed militiaman from ISIS flying a MAGA flag on the back runs me over because it's cheaper than braking, because Elon Musk is from Mars and or Johannesburg, or some red overalled crypto fascist chooses to beat me to death with a blockchain, or Vladimir Putin decides he is Samson, or Facebook decides to cancel this poem before the part about compassion, because what is the alternative when greater love unlocked could yet restore angry nationalists, rigid fundamentalists, and faux intellectuals to a more gentle wokeness that discerns irrefutable truths in the quiet voices and hangs on the incantations of wise trans ascetics ascending escalators, praising the beauty of immigrants. Because we need to turn down the heat, friends, and put the hate back into lead-lined boxes and bury it with the toxic waste of disinformation and repopulate the oceans of respect and cultivate intellectual oases out of the deserts of contemporary banality so we can breathe, so we can live. Because there are now so many of us in our foolish billions that we can stick with the default settings and devour the future like a horde of locusts, or find another way to husband what we still have. Thank you. And I think I'm out of my time, Nondwe, so I'm going to leave it at that.
Thank you so much, David. Can we please give David a round of applause? Unmute yourselves so that we hear it.
Okay. Here we are. Okay.
David, that was amazing. I don't know if I've ever told you this, but the line from the first poem that you read, The Grammar of the Wound, that refrain has haunted me from the first time I heard that poem. The ash falling so delicately, that just, it stays with me. I think it's one of the very few poems where in my head, just that line, I don't think it can ever escape my mind. And I envy the skill that you have with talking about politics without being contrite. It's a skill and I envy it. And I open the floor for questions. Are there any questions in the room?
Yes, please.
Please go ahead.
Where's Where's my hand?
We can hear you.
You can hear me. Now, what I want to know, this he and she, they are
Yes.
both inside you, are they, David? No, they're not. But they're not he and she outside.
What I enjoyed about working on those on those poems, and again, maybe it's one of those things that also Kiev sort of pushes you to do by you in a way want how you've constructed things to resonate at a number of different levels, and I've always found this notion, this Melanie Klein notion of these two psychological positions that we all have in us, the assertive, aggressive, brutal side, and the other one. I think that's in each, we manage that within ourselves, but it is also, it also manifests in our social relations, it manifests in society. So in a funny way, I was hoping in those poems to play around with both what's the struggles within ourselves as an individual, but it can work at the level of relationships. And I think you'll certainly see in quite a few of them, I was trying to sort of push them into a more sort of social, societal space to explore some, why are we in a world at the moment that's just so polarized, and why we can't talk to each other. And the one thing I tried to do in that was to root it in an uncomfortable experience, or an uncomfortable feeling that I myself was feeling. So I don't know whether they work in that way, but I was almost hoping that they generate a certain level of disquiet and discomfort and recognition.
Oh, I think they certainly do that. They certainly do that, but you could feel the tension, in both I say in society, but also the attention in yourself. I think. I think that seemed to come through to me. I may be wrong there.
Thank you, Margaret. Jacques, the floor is yours.
Okay. This is Barbara, actually.
This is Barbara.
Barbara.
Hi. David, I just want to say such a huge thank you. You are a breath of fresh air. And I see that not as a rant, but as a hugely creative rage that this world is needing, and we all need. Yeah. And if everybody could speak up like that instead of being so nice, if we could just say what we really are thinking. I just congratulate you. You are so rich. And I hope you're going to be around a long, long time. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Barbara. Really appreciate that.
Thank you, Barbara. Any other questions in the room? Jacques.
I'm not quite ready to formulate my question, but I suddenly had this fear that there wouldn't be another one, and that you'd say it's interval time. So I'm going to try and formulate it as I go. But what I was so moved as well by your reading, David, and what struck me was how almost each one of these poems is a lament, but also a celebration. So I wanted to know if you were conscious of that as you wrote, or were these poems that were very strongly just compelled you to write them as they were. That's the one thing. And the other, I wonder if I can get away with putting you up to read the poem about Lorca's last lover, because that's just such a powerful poem, and I just want to sing the praises of that poem as well, and of you for writing it. So if you feel like it, you could read it.
Thanks, Jacques. In fact, that was the next, to be honest, because I thought it also linked into some of our themes of this evening. That was, in fact, going to be the next one that I was going to read, and which we didn't get to because I think I'd run out of time. So if Nonwe allows, I would gladly read that one. But just to respond to your first question, Jacques. An issue I actually struggle with is how to be truthful and how to articulate the experience and how to be kind and hopeful at the same time. If that makes sense. I sometimes feel I tend to err on the side of being bleak, but maybe one always just tries to find in it a level of nuance, and in that level of nuance create the space for some form of regeneration. So maybe that's what I try to do a little bit. But I do, the question you ask is almost the question I always struggle with, and I'm trying to finalize a poem, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, my sense is that to wake people up, you actually have to give them strong medicine. If you're determined to make them feel good at the end of it,
yeah,
they may not wake up. I mean, they may not wake up anyway, but you don't want to rush that feeling. I mean, it comes through very strongly in the poem about the civic meeting.
Yeah,
where it's as if you have to remember at the end that that this won't last, but at the same time it doesn't cancel the good thing that happened.
Yeah.
Anyway.
And we live for the magical moments. The magical moments are what creates the positive texture of life in so many moments, and we want to celebrate those and remember those and build our lives around those. But they only come at moments. They're like that. But anyway,
and you hope compassion isn't cancelled.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But
David, sorry to cut you off. Before you read the poem, can Derek first ask his question, and then after the questions, then you can go and read the poem, so that we left with something nice, warm, and fuzzy. Derek,
except I'm not sure whether that's warm and nice, warm and fuzzy.
Hi, Derek.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Yes, well, I'm warm and fuzzy. And I just want to say that I would like to read after the interval because I wrote anti-apartheid poetry in the 80s and 70s, but it's very different. And just as a contrast, to read a couple. And also, I was in Kiev in Ukraine in 1971. And so it was so interesting that he read Ukrainian poets, because the people I met there, I was supposed to be, on an in-tourist guide. It was the USSR, and you weren't allowed to do anything outside the group, but I did. And most Ukrainians said that they were not Russians, they were Ukrainian. And even then, they wanted to be independent. And it's so sad that they're losing that again. Okay, that's all I want to say. Thank you.
Right. Thank you, Derek. I'll keep you in mind for the open mic session.
And then I'll go to the poem, Nonwe.
Yes.
Okay, this poem is now called Ascended, and it's got a subtitle of an account of a life in one room in one moment. And it was written initially as a sort of a writing exercise where we looked at a Kelvin Soul poem actually that repeated this idea of I live in a house. And this was about a room. And then I was also interested in the time at that time, and maybe it was about experiencing you know, a person, my mother, who had dementia at that time, and in a way having that sense of recent memories disappearing and a person's mind as a series of rooms almost closing in on themselves. And then while I was trying to formulate this idea, I read the really interesting story about Juan Ramirez de Lucas, who was in fact Lorca's last lover, a young man of 18. Him and the great poet Lorca had fallen in love. It was the beginning of the Spanish Civil War. They were planning to flee to Mexico. His father, the father of the young man, would not give him permission to leave. Lorca delayed his departure because of this. And if you know the story of Lorca, as a result of that, he was grabbed out of his house by the fascist militia and shot. This young man of 18, if you look at his story, interestingly, he ends up, and you can imagine all the confusions in his life, he ends up joining the Spanish Blue Legion, who fought with the Nazis in Russia. So that's where he ends up, and he's wounded there. And then after that, he becomes this cultural critic for architectural magazines for the rest of his life. So there's that backstory. And out of that, I created this poem, Ascended. I live in a room that is crumbling away, and I try to remember his last poem. Hidden somewhere in the walls is a layer of paint, bubbles up and peels off, revealing the love-bitten wounds blistering below, telescoping me back in time, not sure if it is the room or my memory that is collapsing in on itself, suffocating me like a coffin, and I scream poems of dark love to no one. I live in a room where the rats come out in the dark through holes in the floor and eat the bread I leave for them on the bookshelves because they have finished off the volumes of verse that once fed them, and I have papered over the darkness of the walls with newsprint to ease the years, and a simple table sits in the center under a hanging light, an Underwood typewriter on it that I use to tap out articles on architecture for cultural magazines that all start with a room, because a room is always changing with so many shifting stories concertinaed into it, even as the building that contains the room remains the same. I live in a room with the walls black after the fire, with the sky of night above me, the moon wane to a sliver, and on one wall I have etched in the charcoal paint with my finger his words. Only mystery makes us live, only mystery, that somehow express my grief, for I cannot explain what drove me to rampage across the Russian steppe, or why bleeding out gladly in the snow with everything burning down around me, I found my way back. I live in a room where I can still find small traces of him, a strand of long black hair in the dust under the bed, or a clipping of a fingernail caught between carpet and wall, and I've painted the walls blood red to represent my family's shame in me and mine in them, and his blood was spilled in an olive grove. I leave one small corner unpainted, where he had written in tiny letters even I was not supposed to find. The pain it costs me to love you as I love you. I live in a room where he paints wild horses galloping across the Andalusian plain on one wall, spring blossoms against blue sky, the free air of Harlem on another, Day of the Dead processions from Mexico, land of our dreams, and in the middle of the fourth wall is a teak door from the Amazon carved with fertility icons, and my father bolts it from the outside so I cannot escape with him to Acapulco, even as we hear the banging hammers of the steel being sharpened in the Granada armory. I live in a room of painted scenes from Shakespeare plays and Spanish operas. I was born to be a performer, beautiful and desired as a boy, ready to take the world. I draw a straight black line tight around the room and tell my mother it signifies my fealty to art. And I lie on my bed looking up at the full moon on hot nights with water pouring over me, for the line is the tightrope I am walking. And it is there that he found me. I live in a room in a cot with white walls under an embroidered boy blue blanket full of the smell of eucalyptus oil that my nanny rubs into my chest, and my father is making cooing sounds, and I look up at him. He looks like Federico, and until I see the brush metal mustache. I can hear the fountain. I understand perfectly as my mother's smile comes into focus, and then everything is light. Thanks, Nondwe. That's me.
Thank you so much, David. I think you can see the hands clapping. There's hands everywhere.
Thank you for reading that.
Thanks, Jacques, for asking for it.